Good evening. On behalf of the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here today to the KFAS speaker event. Our goal is to transform Kuwait into a knowledge-based economy, and we strive to achieve this through the promotion of science, technology, and innovation. This evening, we have arranged to have two special guests join us to share their insights and expertise. Dr. Sebastian Fixson is a professor of innovation and design at Babson College. He's joined by Dr. Taker Marion, who is a professor of innovation and new product development. Together, they have teamed up to write their titled book, The Innovation Navigator, which is the subject of this forum today. We hope they will share their insight on how to leverage the perfect storm of digitalization and collaborative culture. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you very much for the introduction. My colleague and I, Dr. Marion, are honored to be here and for the opportunity to give you a short presentation about our work. So as you just saw in the video, the importance of innovation is global. So the same goal that KFAS is pursuing, we see around the world, and the interest for innovation in large part driven by technology and science. So my co-author and I, Taker Marion, and I have been working in this space of innovation for about 10 years now. And over the last couple of years, we have drawn together our academic research into a framework that we offer to make sense of how the world of innovation actually has changed through the influence of digital design on one hand, and what we label as a social development, which is collaborative culture. And so this evening, what we're trying to do is to give you a snapshot of this line of argument and what can be done from a managerial point of view by using our framework. So what you see here on the slide, the Innovation Navigator, became the title of the book that we have recently completed on this work. And so we are very glad to give you some snapshot of the content. So let me start by setting the stage a little bit. So what you see here is data collected by a global management consultant company called Boston Consulting Company over the last 10 years, basically asking CEOs of global companies about their assessment of the role that innovation plays for their companies. Right? And as you see across the 10 years from 2005 to 2015, with the exception of the financial crisis in around 2007, 2008, the importance that these leaders put to innovation has been continuously increasing. Let me show you another snapshot of data, this time collected by another global consulting company, McKinsey. What it says is essentially the same thing, that a large portion, you see here 84% of business leaders consider innovation important for the growth of their business, and in fact see through the churn 4/5 of their business at risk through innovation by their competitors. The interesting part, however, is the other number that you see here, the 6%. So despite the fact that a very large portion of global leaders consider innovation a critical element for their companies to survive, a very small portion is satisfied with the current level of performance of their own organizations in the aspect of innovation. So that gap was the motivator for our work, and the question, how can we help organizations to become better at innovating, especially in the current context, given where we are in technology as well as in social development. In order to make the case for our argument, let me lead you to a little detour throughout history. And I want you to think about this notion that for the vast majority of history, the functions of designing, manufacturing, and consuming products was actually within one individual. So let's suppose we go back to the medieval times. Very few people lived like this young lady who might have had a living environment like this that more resembles how many of us live today. But the vast majority of people lived very simple lives with very simple products. And though the quality and sophistication of these products around them was obviously limited by their own resources and skills. But they were also, within the constraints of their skills, if you will, customized to their own needs. Right? They themselves were the user of their products. But if you look back in those days, the products were very simple and very, because they didn't require much tooling and skills, the products had a limited variety, if you will. In fact, where the two of us live in Boston, there's a museum, and so the pictures you see here display the village that has been rebuilt where the Pilgrims lived when they arrived in 1620 in North America. So it's just outside Boston. But the interesting point here is if you look at the lower right, can I get this? You see a few sophisticated furniture pieces which the Pilgrims brought over from England, but everything else is very, very simple, right? The huts are essentially have dirt floor, have no windows, just shutters and doors, and there are one room where the fireplace is right next to the bed. So this is 400 years ago, and at that time, everybody who survived the first winter there had to be able to produce all the goods they needed to survive. Now what happened in society was that around 300 years ago, things changed drastically, right? So the artisans were replaced by large corporations that grew very quickly. And one of the consequences of that was that work got specialized. So rather, instead of designing and making and ultimately using in its entirety the products, be it a chair or a house, people became very specialized in what they do. So here you see a room full of engineers working on drawing tables with very specific tasks. And manufacturing changed in the same way. Right? So you probably have seen, I don't know, a movie with Modern Times with Charlie Chaplin that made fun of the fact that some of the work was reduced to very simple movements. That was all the person did. But the image is that you became a small cog in a large machine, and that the work became sort of foreign to the individual workers because it was the connection to the larger theme was less and less clear. On the other hand, the scaling of these production processes led to a drastic decrease in cost and in the prices of these goods and led to mass markets, right? So suddenly many people could afford a car or some of these products. And so you could see, in order to make this work, the variety had to be drastically reduced, right? You had a large number of identical products being produced. So these are images from the Ford Motor Company right before World War I, or around the time. And you see there's zero variation in the products in order to keep the costs down. We see similar developments, and these are images from North America, in the development of the housing initially, where these are Henry Ford, in addition to being an owner of a large manufacturing company, was interested in the betterment of the living environment of his people. And the images you see here show the difference that he found versus the one that were promoted by his company. This image in the lower right corner shows only one house, but if you could zoom out, you would see that the houses look all the same. Right? And today you can find these settlements with a large number of identical houses. And the same logic applied, right? They were affordable because they were identical. So this, for the most part, was driven by the Industrial Revolution. And it also, at least initially, required that you as a user were quite sophisticated in the understanding of the machine. Right? So you see this gentleman here starting his car. In those days, you better knew how to operate the vehicle. Not only operate, but repair it. Otherwise, you wouldn't go very far. Right? Contrast that with our world today, where we operate devices, cars, smartphones, with very little understanding for most of us what actually happens inside of it. And a very high expectation about the quality, right? We expect that nothing happens for a very long time. So around post-World War II, in most parts of the world, the situation changed dramatically. Large number of houses and households were beginning to be filled with products you see here, computers and refrigerators, cars, even airplanes. So on top of the scaling effect of the manufacturing, large-scale manufacturing processes, the quality went up dramatically. But for a long time, they still were very, very similar, the products, right? The degree of customization was fairly low. We argue that that is changing as well. So just as 300 years ago, what we have been living through the last 20 years is a change of two large forces into a third era. And so the world we see today looks more like this, right? So these are examples of products where the degree of customization goes very, very far. My guess is if I had to ask you now to pull out your smartphone, most of you had some kind of case that made sure that it's visible as your phone and not your neighbor's, right? So that's what you see in the top left corner. But it goes further. So in the top and the bottom right corner is an example of a furniture store that only starts producing once there is interest of enough customers. And the bottom left corner are services where machine learning is helping to create customized curation of your wardrobe. So how does that happen? And what does that mean for work and ultimately for innovation in companies? So what we've seen in the last 20 years is that the digitization has changed the way we work, right? Most of you, I'm quite certain, have a computer in front of you of your everyday work. So you've learned to operate these machines and have sort of extended your power through these means. We see also a lot of younger people starting companies, right? So this gets into the social dimension of what we have observed, who through these tools have been put in a position far more powerful than their parent generation was ever able to do. Right? We also see changes in work environments, right? These young people now engage in hackathons and are interacting with large companies that a generation ago were very separate from another. Oops. So as a result, we see the world impacted by the vast advancement of digital technology. So here you see on the top left corner a chair that was designed by artificial intelligence, if you will. It was through a process called generative design, where you assign the load to the part and the computer decides where material is. On the lower left-hand corner, you see an advanced example for dental surgery, where you can make visible the canals for nerves, etc. But then you also see in the way we interact strong effects through digitization. So these examples are Airbnb, most of you probably know, and the lower portion is a bike-sharing company active in Toronto, Canada. So as a historical background, the argument we are making that we have entered a third era of innovation in which the industrial professionals that you saw are going to be replaced more and more by what we label digital explorers. And one of the key aspects, in addition to the technical skills, is, in other words, that some of the hierarchical, probably not all, but some of the hierarchical aspects are going to be replaced by self-selection and self-coordination mechanisms. Let me briefly detail a little bit why we think these two forces, one we label the digitization or the digital creation, the other one social collaborative culture, where do they come from? So the first one, this diagram shows the increase of computing power over the last 150 years. And what you notice is that for the first 100 years, it was fairly flat. And the scale that you see here is logarithmic, so the growth is dramatic. But over the last 40 years, computing power has become so cheap that it's ubiquitous and no longer a constraining factor. And as a result, we see in production processes, in creation processes, a widespread increase of the use of digital tools. And by extension, the growth of power ideas that can be put into practice by almost anybody, right? Of the whole range, you have experts who produce very advanced technology, but also on the lower end, you have now students who can start building products and by very quickly as well businesses, in part through the development of these tools. And there's a whole range of examples. The world we are studying has often, not always, but often to do with products. So what you see here are 3D CAD systems that are now also in the cloud-based function, but also project management tools and communication tools that allow this type of work. In a separate study, Tucker and I looked into the increasing use of communication tools of various kinds, so from project management, document management, to knowledge management, and the same thing has happened over the last 20 years. The second force that we observe, in addition to the technical development, has more to do with how we interact with each other. Right? And the emergence of things like Airbnb, most people probably would have considered impossible even 20 years ago, right? That people are willing to stay in strangers' houses that they met on the internet, literally, and vice versa, that people would invite others into their house without knowing much about them. And yet, within a few years, it has become one of the most successful businesses on the planet, which suggests that the way we interact with each other is changing. Right? But we see that similar in the professional realm. In most traditional organizations, there exists a hierarchy and a contractual relationship between employee and the company. Right? And through that comes a direction of what kind of work the employee engages in, and the hierarchy decides all of that. We see more and more, however, now work arrangement both within and outside across company boundaries that follow more self-selection mechanisms, right? So that the task is put out there and those who are interested in self-select into participating and often even self-coordinate how they collaborate with each other. This is a fundamental shift of how people work with each other. So those two, and you see this in, for instance, in communities online in particular, where the communication costs, so that's an aspect where the advancement of digitalization and the changes in social connection come together, because it becomes very, very cheap to form very quickly very large communities and find the right people you want to interact with. So what our argument then is that these two forces, the digital creation and the collaborative culture, are not only changing our world independently of each other, but they also reinforce each other. Right? So digitized designs, for instance, are easy to share, easy to distribute. The collaborative culture leads to using a lot of more services so that work gets exchanged. The cloud-based structure of our communication system, if you will, allows access from everywhere, and more of products and services are offered as services, just as the software as a service. So what we then argue is that these two forces actually create a mechanism that has enlarged what we label the innovation landscape, or the extended innovation landscape. So the digital forces have done two things. One, for the expert, they allow now the design of solutions that were unthinkable a few years ago. And on the lower end, it has broadened dramatically the population that can participate in these activities. So think about the student entrepreneur who creates a business by relying on digital tools that are easy to access and in some cases even free to use. Right? On the vertical axis, the social changes that I just mentioned have led to new forms of collaboration, some of them based on trust, and via the internet also enabled to be distributed, and people collaborate around the world. So then these two forces, that comes back to this picture I showed you earlier, that the digital revolution in our argument has led that the traditional mode has been replaced by 4 different modus operandi, as we say, to innovate. And we have labeled them modes because In our logic, you as a company can engage in one or more of these, but you have to understand that they have certain consequences and need to be managed in a certain way. So let me stop here at this point to laying out this enlarged landscape with these 4 innovation modes, and me hand over to my colleague Tucker Marion, who will introduce all of these modes individually in more detail to give you a complete picture of what we're looking at today.
Thank you, Sebastian. One of the things that, to follow on what Sebastian was talking about, was the fact that what we noticed over time is with digital design and digitization and a collaborative environment is that individuals were self-selecting, working on projects that they were interested in. And this can happen both inside and outside the corporation. And on the bottom half of this, for this 2x2, you see that. You have people acting in a more entrepreneurial manner inside a company, which we label the venture mode. But then also outside, we have outside individuals that may be distributed around the world but have an interest in some subject. Maybe it's a software application or maybe it's a design, and operating in what we call a community mode. On the upper half of this matrix, we have what would be considered more formal engagements. Of course, most companies operate in the upper left. That would be the specialist mode, where they have an expertise in a service or a product. BMW might be an example of a specialist that makes high-end automobiles. But then also we notice, because of the expanded innovation landscape, that many companies are experimenting with actually letting outside actors or companies or vendors actually input and have a substantial influence on the total innovation of that product or service. And that's what we call the network mode. And we're going to dive into each one of these modes in more detail. So the specialist mode is really what most companies traditionally operate in. But digitization and the collaborative environment have allowed companies to develop that actually arrange their entire business model to leverage the changes that the perfect storm has allowed. And one of them is a Canadian company called Dental Wings. And what they do is they produce dental implants and jigs to actually improve the efficiency and also the efficacy of dental implants. And they use digital design to not only scan bones, jaw, and teeth, but actually use that information to create very precise jigs to allow posts to be put in to the jawbone, but also much more comfortable implants and false teeth. In addition, it also allows better patient healing and a better outcome for the dentist and the patient. And all of this is arranged and developed through a software platform that Dental Wings has developed. And of course, they also leverage 3D printing technology to manufacture the dental implants, posts, and jigs themselves. So they're not only offering a better product in terms of physical product, but they're also offering a better service. And the digitization that they have done, along with collaborative tools and software and being able to interact with the patient and the caregiver in a new way, has transformed this type of business from what it was before. In the venture mode, as I had mentioned, and as Sebastian had mentioned, there's an interesting phenomenon. Because the barriers to entry have lowered for individuals, it's allowing them to work on things and collaborate where they didn't before. And I'll give you an example. Earlier in the presentation, we showed a picture of 3 young gentlemen. They're based in the Boston area, and they developed a new company that actually makes vinyl turntables. It's actually a growing market globally, people wanting to be more attached to their music rather than listening to digital music. But what they did is they actually developed this company, prototyped it, and developed it and commercialized it using all of the digitization tools that we have currently available, from services to access prototypes to using unused manufacturing equipment through different services that put them in touch. They were also to develop small-scale manufacturing capability, and they were able to kind of maximize crowdfunding, not only internally through a local university, but also utilizing Kickstarter, where they raised over $230,000 to start their business. All of this collectively, they were able to start this business, establish a small factory in the Boston area, for a little over $250,000. They now have 25 employees. And the services and technology that they used would not be available to really anyone 15 or 20 years ago. So the lower barriers to entry provided by the perfect storm of digitization and collaborative tools has allowed individuals to do this. Now this is an example of a small company that's done this on the outside, but this sort of thing is being done inside companies, allowing individual employees to start new product lines, new products, new services, by themselves. And it's allowing companies to actually become more entrepreneurial, empowering the base of their employees. And I'm going to give you an example of that. This is a company that spent over 10 years creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem within their company. EMC was started over 40 years ago in the Boston area. Now it's merged with Dell to create Dell EMC. And about 10 years ago, the CTO wanted to increase venturing within the company, and you see their operating revenues over time. But what they did is they created what they called the Innovation Network, and it allowed individual employees to submit ideas to the company to see a subset of those ideas become more mature, commercialize, and add new revenue to the business. This is, on the blue line, is the number of submissions over the time that this system was submitted by employees of the company. The one thing that's interesting about this case study is the support from upper management, the CTO and an innovation team working under him that worked on improving and revising this system over time, over a 10-year period. And when they first started this particular innovation network ecosystem, they took a lot of submissions total from the global company. They selected some finalists from the internal team, and those winners were then given some prizes, and some of them continued on, but some of them didn't. And those that didn't may have been very promising projects. So what they noticed actually was that they needed to rejigger the system and actually develop a more refined and more mature innovation system for these particular projects. So what they did, they still had submissions that were open, but they had particular challenges that were sponsored from business unit heads. It may have been a new virtual cloud-based management software or a new type of, let's say, server component. Those challenges were then broadcast to the company. Now, of course, again, finalists were selected and winners were chosen. But one of the things that was a key difference that they did is that they actually developed an incubation system where these individuals or small teams were given coaching and mentoring and small amounts of funding to actually mature those products. And ultimately, those that went through this system were much more successful than those that did not have that kind of care and support. Over time, though, what they noticed is that they could, there were different tracks that the innovation submissions followed. Now, of course, on the bottom of this slide, they noticed that many were incremental product or process improvements, which if you have submissions, they're still important to improve the efficiency of a product line or improve the feature set of a particular software platform. On the middle layer there, that's the innovation competitions that they would hold annually. Those winners and finalists were then given small amounts of money, as I had mentioned, but then mentored. But they still gave this top line, they still thought it was important to be ambidextrous and still have the ability to have radical innovations be proposed and be worked on, because those might transform the corporation over time. The interesting thing about this example at EMC, as I had mentioned, that it was developed and refined and supported over the long term. Often when you think about a venture mode, companies will establish an innovation lab. Maybe they'll identify a couple people to work at it. Maybe they'll sponsor an innovation contest. And if they don't see results immediately, unfortunately, those efforts can be shut down. To be truly successful, companies need to think about this mode long term and invest in it and keep at it and keep revising and refining it. And the importance of mentoring and supporting individuals or small teams to go through that process is important. And that includes the ability for them to leave their existing job to start this new venture within the company. All told, over 10 years, EMC estimates that this effort of the Innovation Network contributed over $500 million in new revenue to the company. So it was quite successful. The community mode. given the fact that we are a global society now with many or most of the population connected through various social platforms and the internet, it allows companies to cast a much wider net to interface with customers, let's say, for example, on Facebook, or to link and partner with a site like Innocentive, which actually has teams of expert individuals that can work on a problem that you might identify. This is an example of a project. There was an oil spill in the United States several years ago, and BP, one of the oil companies, actually put a charge on Innocentive to actually help clean oil that was spilled in very cold water. And when that happened, they couldn't actually easily pump that water out from separating salt water and the oil. The actual solution was proposed by a civil engineer who worked in the mixing of concrete. And it was that agitation and spinning of water combined with oil that they were able to separate that. Now, maybe BP or the oil company may have figured that out over time, but casting a wide net puts you in touch with experts that may have complementary or adjacent skills that may be applied to a unique problem. That's one of the benefits of increasing the number of people that may look at a particular problem. Organizations like NASA use open innovation and community efforts greatly in terms of improving software for things like a Martian lander and other aspects that they have experimented with over time. Here's an example of Innocentive, and the interesting thing about this particular slide is the variety of very difficult problems that are listed. We have on the bottom, we have a call to solve an issue with oral vaccination of different viruses. Up top, we have a food-based innovation, looking at dessert toppings using mono or polyunsaturated oils. These are very, very different projects, but the community of Innocentive has a broad breadth of expertise that may lend an interesting possible solution from that community that would be important and impactful to the company that has posted on this particular site. The network mode in that upper top band of our 2x2 is an interesting development over the last 20 years, because what it is doing, it is actually putting the central innovation efforts for your particular service or product in the hands of people outside the corporation. And if we think of a company like Onshape, Onshape is a fairly new computer-aided design company in the Boston area, founded by one of the founders of SolidWorks, one of the most well-known and well-used computer-aided design software packages in the world. And their thought was, well, we wanted to have a CAD-based, cloud-based, easy-to-use CAD system. But there's one difference that they have. They have actually allowed outside developers to develop new applications and modules for that software, which actually enhances its capability. So an outside person that may have a particular interesting idea to model fluids or fluid dynamics can develop that application and have it be available to the Onshape community, which adds value not only to the user, but to the company itself. Not unlike what Apple did over 10 years ago with the App Store. So what Onshape actually does is it serves as a platform for innovation, and very interesting innovation going on by outside developers that will ultimately actually add value not only to the user, as I had mentioned, but also the company itself. And it also serves as an additional source of revenue. So thinking about the changes in business model that new modes can bring to the company. So one of the things that Sebastian and I wanted to do is, given the expanded landscape and the challenges of each of the different modes, was to try to organize them in a fashion that was understandable for the manager or executive. And this framework is an attempt to do that. And let me illustrate that by using some company examples. One of the things that we found is that modes and companies using different modes are not static. They actually can move over time. If you look at the case of Apple, Apple was a classic venture. It started in 1976, went IPO in 1979, and moved into the specialist mode. They made computers and software integrated. They had their own factories in California. And they operated as a specialist until approximately 1998. And at that time, that was the time when Tim Cook and Steve Jobs really took over Apple and started to change it operationally and moved it into the network mode. Being able to shed manufacturing operations, and not just manufacturing, but very specific development of critical hardware components, but then also allowing outside developers to add value to things like the iPhone and iPad and other products that have been commercialized over time. But while companies can shift different modes and operate from one to the next, we've also seen a phenomenon where companies are experimenting in multiple modes at once. Now, of course, GE is in the news lately for issues with stock price and other things, but if you actually look on the factory floor of what they have done with experimenting in different modes, like GE Garages and fostering internal ventures, interfacing with communities with their First Build initiative, maximizing the interface between patients, doctors, and healthcare providers in their healthcare unit. It's very, very interesting what's going on, combined with the digitization of the company as a whole. So one of the things to think about over time, and going back to what Sebastian had talked about in the first slides, when he talked about Boston Consulting and the McKinsey Group, is what can you do to increase the percentage of innovation successes that you have and how executives feel about their innovation efforts as they go forward. One of the things that we feel is important is the fact that firms need to become multimodal organizations. They need to be skilled at operating in each of these different modes, because each of these different modes have opportunities and challenges also at different points in the innovation process. So with that, that brings us to our last slide, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much for having us, and I think we'll open it to questions.
To what extent the model that you have presented for EMC is different than the traditional Kaizen management improvement systems that the Japanese have been following, I believe, since the 80s or earlier?
I think we'll both answer this. I'll answer first and then he'll. So if you look at traditional lean and Kaizen continuous improvement process, generally, well, they have been used both in manufacturing and in product development, right? We understand that. But generally, what they have done is looked at existing things that are going on within the organization and proposing improvements, and then measuring those improvements to remove waste, to make things faster, and that's all very important. One of the things that is interesting about EMC is over time they recognize in that bottom funnel is that, sure, there are many incremental improvements that are being proposed by employees that are not too dissimilar from what you might see in a traditional lean method deployed at a company. What is unique, though, is that lean is not necessarily conducive to radical changes or brand new businesses or brand new services within a company. It's not necessarily conducive to developing entrepreneurs at the employee level. And this comes from someone that spent a long time in the auto industry working on lean methods, and I think they're very valuable. But that's what they're very different for it's a different purpose. And it really is what the EMC Innovation Network was designed to do, was to inspire individuals to think of new businesses and new sources of revenue. That's what's different between that and Kaizen or any of the Japanese methods.
How does this affect non-manufacturing activities? For example, skill sets such as knowledge of law, or a manual job such as driving or being a captain of a ship. How does this really affect those kinds of intangible skill sets that are not something that is usually transferred into paper or into processes?
So I think what I would say is that the entrepreneurial activity that Tucker just described, sorry, I can't really see you, that Tucker just described is a very powerful force, both from a motivational standpoint for many actors. And so in our universities, we see many, many more students also interested in developing their own ideas, be them product or service. So that is a very, very strong driver, which often also leads to entirely new business models that established organizations not necessarily would pursue. And they can be in all kinds of places. And they might even challenge existing legal structures. So if you think about in the United States, the discussion about Uber or Airbnb and the cities trying to respond with all the consequences that have. That certainly wouldn't have been developed by a lawyer itself, but someone else challenged that and felt encouraged to challenge that. And I think what we see is that this is happening more and more, and that means for leaders in existing organization to think about how to harness that. To give you one example, Daimler-Benz, the German car company, has created an internal mechanism similar to EMC to draw on the ideas of the internal employees. And the explicit motivation is that they said, our founder, Gottlieb Daimler, in 1886, left his job because his boss didn't want him to work on what he wanted to work on. In retrospect, this company, Otto, was an engine manufacturer, could have become Daimler. Instead, someone else created this large company. And so they said today, we want to avoid the repetition of that. We want the next innovator to do it in our house, not outside. But in order to allow that, we have to change. Sure. Maybe if you move over, then I can sit next to you.
Good evening. My name is Hassan. My name is Hassan Gura, thank you, from Box Hill College, Kuwait. I believe your model is more focusing on what's known maybe in academia as corporate entrepreneurship. How about new startups? And do you believe new startups as, outside the organization? Also, do you believe that your model can be applicable in emerging economies such as Kuwait? Thank you.
So I think the social change that we observe and the interest and willingness of young people to do their own thing and be more heard and can follow more their own intention and interest affects both the startup world as well as the corporate world. In fact, we labeled this one mode venture mode because we felt this is exactly what ventures are trying to do. And if large companies don't want to be surprised and at some point overtaken, they better learn to do this in-house. So that's also the reason why we chose the word mode, because we felt it's a way of operating. And that can be done, or it's natural for startups, but it can be learned to be done by existing companies.
And that's a great question that you asked, because originally one of our research areas were new ventures, because we noticed that all of these tools and the lower barriers to entry to be able to design and network with outside experts, to be able to find low-cost manufacturing sources, really help the individual venture get started. So that was kind of the impetus, or what for us, for what is actually going on here and how is this changing the way people might innovate. And ultimately, we settled on corporate innovation, as that corporate innovation should take inspiration from those individuals, like those 3 individuals that started that turntable company, to do that within the corporate walls, to have some of the agility and some of the leanness that is going on with, frankly, very small startups, and give that power to the large corporation. And the last part of your question is, I think that what we've seen over time, in some ways, all of these lower barriers to entry, it can help anyone from a large corporation to a developing economy. And I think that any organization or any area can think about improving the ability of their citizens or employees to innovate by trying to engage in these different modes, from thinking about how can we better develop an innovation ecosystem in the network, just what is going on here and has gone on with KFAS, and thinking of the network mode. So I think that is very applicable to what's going on in areas such as Kuwait.
I'm just curious about if you're looking forward, projecting out 10, 20 years or maybe farther, based on what you've seen from history and what we have right now, where you see things going, both in the United States and perhaps in emerging economies.
So I think, as Tucker just mentioned, the availability and relative low-cost nature of many digital tools levels the playing field around the world, both in terms of across countries as well as between large and small companies, right? So some of the CAD work where we started, we're both engineers originally, that would have been impossible for startups 20 years ago. And today, most of these tools are free and very easy to learn, and you have a whole host of tutorials on the web, and you can find community members. So the barriers of entry have dropped dramatically. So I think what we will, and that is, I think, also the reason why established companies should really be concerned about that, because it will become more fluid and it's unclear who will win, right? And I think on the individual level, the greater entrepreneurial nature is a little bit both. It's a great opportunity, but it's also responsibility for individuals, right? So we will all be more required to figure out something for ourselves.
And to follow on to that, and one of the things that we thought about it in one of our framework has 4 modes, but there will be new modes in the future, and it's tough to forecast what those modes might be, but of course artificial intelligence and those particular companies or individuals that best leverage in AI mode, you can certainly see that over the next 5 to 10 years as being a further expansion of the landscape.
Sure.
I need another follow-up question on the EMC. Normally, most companies, most corporations, they have a framework, and it's very difficult to think out of the box. So they are there to produce certain products, certain things, and so on. How did EMC manage to the management side of this innovation? Is it because most companies are structured and each part of the company is doing its business and so on. So how did they structure the introduction of this new type of innovative products to be introduced inside within the company and then eventually contribute to the company growth?
So the impetus was really the CTO who joined the company in 2007 and said and felt, I need to turbocharge this company in terms of how it's developed it and take advantage of all the creativity that exists in the company, not only in the R&D units. So initially that was a decision by someone high enough to put some resources and effort into that. Over time, the system produced results, right? And people saw what came out of it, and that generated more and more support. And the last version, before EMC was taken over by Dell, you saw that on the bottom of the slide that Tucker presented, there's ongoing innovation activities. And there they even went into the HR structure because they said, all right, individual managers will receive the submission on an ongoing basis, but we will know what they do with that. So they can't shut it down and put it in their drawer, individual submissions. So over time, I think the organization changed by that, but the initial starting point was someone high enough who said we're going to do that.
And one thing that's in that case was, it's not trivial, is that the organization certainly invested in its employees, and the culture was one in which the company was very willing to train employees, to educate them, so they had very generous benefits towards that, and that also allowed them to develop a structure and a system for that mentoring, that they would actually give resources to those individuals to promote entrepreneurship during that period of time when that innovation network was in place. Any other questions?
Was that
Anyone?
a question or just
No,
stretching
just a
the arms?
stretch.
Okay.
Oh, I think we have one back there. 2 back. Oh, 1.
Just a very quick question. To what extent are the large established companies or organizations behaving like individuals? So are they working with each other or using or complementing each other's resources and specialisms in the same way that individuals seem to be doing when they just do a startup?
So there's an example that was interesting is Ford and General Motors in the United States are very fierce competitors. As an example, in the network mode, they actually came together to develop a brand new type of automotive transmission. 9 and 10 speed automatic and used in various trucks and different things. That was the first time that they had done that. So if you think of an organization as an individual, those two came together, they saw a mutual interest, they shared resources, and they're both benefiting from that particular development of that system.
And I think what I would add is that if you look at products and services in our day and age, they are almost always part of larger systems. And it becomes, for the individual competing companies, more and more clear that they can compete only with the appropriate partners, whether that's advanced battery development or car companies getting into mobility solutions. I think it's very clear for all the players that no one has all the knowledge required to maintain and develop an entire system. And so in that sense, I think there's a competitive pressure to behave more collaborative, even on the corporate level.
Anyone else? Another question?
Correct me if I am wrong, but I think the main idea, probably from the lecture, is to provide more incentives for individuals within the organization to behave more entrepreneurially inside the organization, so they don't leave the organization and start their own venture. Is this the main idea?
That's certainly the key idea for the venture mode. And the venture mode is, we think, one of the very important modes that companies have to pursue. Right? They still might need to develop very specific technical expertise in the specialist mode, and develop ways to access larger communities outside. So the image that Tucker showed of GE is actually a company that is purposefully and consciously pursuing different innovation initiatives in different ways. But one of the 4 important ones clearly is the one that turns more of the employees into internal entrepreneurs, if you will.
And I think that one of the main takeaways from our perspective of what we've worked on is the fact that for companies to succeed now going forward, they need to be comfortable in operating each of these different modes. Not only from a strategic level, but on a project level, they can use actually some modes together in sequence or in parallel to enhance the outcomes of particular projects. For example, being able to source some ideas from the community, and then being able to pair that with an internal venture to kind of create a concept, to then leverage the network mode to actually get it to market. So a company being able to do that with ease will be very valuable to companies going forward.
Last year we tried to, in my company, we tried to automate processes, and we tried to digitize also processes and our workflows and everything. So a limit that we have seen is that some people are scared, not because that they don't want it new, they're scared, they're afraid that their job would be not needed anymore. So they're scared that we would go to that next level just because they're scared to lose their jobs. How can we cross that limit or not see that?
So I think that's a very natural response, right? If I make a suggestion and the suggestion leads to me losing my job, I don't really are incentivized to make further suggestions in this direction. I think that what this means is that the leadership of the company has to think about how to make use of that creative and entrepreneurial energy beyond just eliminating that person's job. I mean, this discussion is age-old in all kinds of production improvement situations, where if the answer is that people lose their job, they're not interested in participating in any improvement, right? So if you make a process more efficient, then leadership's role is to get more business in a simplified way. And I think the entrepreneurial creativity of employees should be nurtured to generate new opportunities. Some of them are cost saving, but others might be generating new revenue streams. Anything else?
Anything else? Anyone?
Oh, going twice. Mona?
Great.
Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for the great questions. Appreciate it.
The rest of the answers are important. Thank you very much.